Welcome to Conversations with the Planets with Lori Kaufman and Alicia Cielle Heiser, a podcast that roots the wisdom of the stars into our lived experiences here on Earth and weaves the power of diverse healing modalities together with astrology. And today we're going to be sharing some asteroid stories about Adonis and Ceres and how they show up personally in my birth chart. And we have another episode out called Asteroids 101 where we talk about like what are the asteroids, how to find out if they're in your chart, like where different asteroids are placed, what asteroids are the most significant, how to interpret them, kind of all of the basic interpretive stuff about that. So that's down in the show notes. And if you want to learn more about how to work with asteroids, please go listen to that episode and then come back to hear more of the stories of how it plays out, because this episode is going to be a little bit more focused on storytelling and sharing how I have experienced Adonis and Ceres as asteroids and like mythic deities showing up in my life. So, and then we'll talk just kind of about underworld stuff in general. Lori can share a little about like Demeter and Persephone as well. Um, so yeah. Do you have anything to add to that, Lori?
Um, no, the only thing I will say is I think asteroids are so open to interpretation in so many different ways. And I think the most important thing is just seeing how they relate to you and relate to others in storytelling. We love to just share these stories of like, this is how I've seen this mythology play out in my life, in my story. And so yeah, just that's the way to learn them. That's the way to see it.
That is so well said. Yeah, asteroids are really fun because they invite
Mhm.
personal lived stories in, and then they can help you connect with ways that you're living out these kind of broader global stories that are weaving through all of our lives.
Yeah, and once you start really paying attention to, I mean, what I call the breadcrumbs, you just start realizing how much symbolism is like actually in your day-to-day life. And that's a big thing that I also want to do an episode on later. It's like I pull a card of the day with tarot and then I like pay attention throughout the day of like the symbolism in the card. Like yesterday I pulled the star and I saw the literal like eight-pointed star every single place I went. And so
Mm,
even just, like, using things like the asteroids or tarot or whatever your modality, to use it as, like, a way to communicate with the universe and the way to pay attention and the way to just, like, look for symbolism, it's just, like, a fun little, like, game. An I Spy
yeah.
game. Yeah.
And it's always so fun when you see like how things show up and you're like, oh, whoa, there
Yeah.
that is.
Mhm. And
So
all
speaking of
modalities will tell you the same way.
yeah, things and that's kind of what will make things the most potent. Like we'll talk about in this
Mhm,
episode. I have like four different really significant planets and asteroids that connect back to underworld mythology and the
mhm.
Demeter, Hades, Persephone myth in particular. And so that's a myth that like I am living out, and there's four different indicators, not just one, but all these different ones that point to similar things. And just in general with your astrological interpretation, if you see multiple different things in a chart or, with your transits or progressions or whatever you're looking at, and multiple things are pointing to similar topics or similar stories, then you can really know either in your life or your client's life that like that is really potently showing up. And so when things just show up multiple times in multiple ways, it's like, yeah, that's definitely part of my lived experience. And I can
Mhm.
confirm from my own personal experience with my life beyond the astrology as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So speaking of that, just to share kind of like who is Adonis, I'll start with Adonis. Um, because the asteroid Adonis is 2 degrees away from my ascendant in Libra. And and I was first informed of that when I got an astrology reading with Michael J. Morris, who works with asteroids a lot. So shout out to them as well, because they're an amazing astrologer who's doing a lot of really
Mhm.
good work with asteroids. And Adonis is the genderqueer lover of both Aphrodite and Persephone in Greek mythology. And they were born of a sapling, and when they were born, they were so beautiful, like so stunningly beautiful, that Aphrodite wanted to keep them as her lover. But she had to hide Adonis away in the underworld for them to grow up to be safe. And so she entrusted Adonis with Persephone. And Persephone also fell in love with Adonis because they were so beautiful. And so Persephone and Aphrodite engaged in like all these fights and were fighting over who got to have Adonis. And Zeus comes in and like is the arbiter and says, okay, you each get Adonis for 4 months out of the year. And then for the other 4 months, they can choose where they want to go. And the most common version of the myth says that they end up spending the second of their, or the third of their 4 months. So they spend 8 months with Aphrodite and then four with Persephone. And Adonis is also a very skilled hunter. They love to hunt and frolic in the woods, and one day, Aphrodite begs Adonis not to go out, knowing that they are putting themselves in grave danger. And they go out anyway because they love to be in the woods and they love to hunt so much. And they end up dying. And different versions of the myth say they die in different ways. One of the more common ones is that Ares, jealous of Adonis and Aphrodite, turns into a boar and hunts and kills Adonis. But regardless, Adonis bleeds out in Aphrodite's arms, and the mixture of their blood and the mixture of Aphrodite's tears becomes the anemone flower that grows from the earth. There's also versions of the myth where Adonis is the lover of Dionysus, where Adonis is very queer. There's different interpretations that Adonis, could be considered intersect, or to have, like atypical genitalia, essentially. They're very genderqueer. They're very non-monogamous. The way that Adonis exists is very like resistant to this, modern heteronormative, like men are men, women are women, black and white. We only love the opposite sex. Gender is the same as sex. Like Adonis is very, very resistant to all of those sorts of misunderstandings of how sex and gender shows up. And after they die, they are reincarnated and made immortal. And so they really tell the story of death and rebirth. And
Mm.
they're celebrated in ancient Greece around midsummer. And in ancient Greece, all of the women around midsummer would climb up onto their rooftops, and they would have all these wilting plants, because you think of midsummer and all these like ephemeral herbs that will sprout and then kind of
Mhm.
immediately die because it's too hot, and they're just like these light fluffy plants. And so it's this time of like death and youth, or as Kristen Mathis will put it when she talks about Adonis, like the beauty of sunset with wildfire smoke, like the beauty of death and youth and
Mhm.
this like ephemeral dying plant, and like climate change is terrifying but the world is still beautiful. Like those sorts of contradictory non-binary ways of being are very
Mhm.
at the core of Adonis's myth, and the women of ancient Greece would kind of celebrate and wail to that. And so they would go on their roofs and they would wail loudly and mournfully for the loss of life and for Adonis dying so young. And it was documented that they would disturb like the men's democratic meetings in the town center and stuff with their wailing for Adonis. And so that's everything that I have uncovered about Adonis in my research. And it's crazy the number of ways that it aligns with my life, actually. Um, because I live very cyclically and seasonally, which is part of what the underworld mythology teaches us, is that there's a time for living, there's a time for dying. The myth of
Yeah.
Persephone explains the passing of seasons. When Persephone goes underground, Demeter is mourning her absence and doesn't allow plants to grow. And then when Persephone returns, the plants sprout and it's spring again. So underworld mythology calls us into our more cyclical, seasonal nature of life. and I am spending 4 months. Adonis's time is, split into 4 months. I'm spending 4 months living in Utah to go skiing for the winter. I'm currently sitting in my basement bedroom. I have had so many crazy housing experiences trying to live in Utah. This is my second full winter here. Maybe we can talk about that in a transits episode. But like I've lived multiple places in Utah and the vast majority of them have been basements. And so this is like my winter underworld time where I go to frolic in the woods, which is what Adonis does as a hunter. And like I love to ski through the trees, like ski really close to the trees, like I'm not too dangerous, but I definitely do take more risks than a lot of people would with skiing, which is part of what Adonis is known for. Um, and one thing that I think is really crazy about asteroids is the way they come into our consciousness when we're ready for them. And so when I got my
Yes.
reading with Michael, that let me know that Adonis, that I am an embodiment of Adonis's mythology with them conjunct my ascendant, which, the ascendant has to do with your body and your embodied experience. I found that out last March when I was here in Utah doing my first full like winter season of skiing, like my 4 months underworld time. And I also was coming more into like what it means for me to be gender queer, and that still is something that I'm sure I'll always be working with because like gender in this world is very confusing. But I'd always thought of myself as like a very traditional, like feminine femme person, even though like I'm queer with my sexuality. And over the past year or so, I've been getting more into just like the more fluid ways that I experience my gender. And then Adonis makes themselves known to me, right? As I'm living out their mythology, not before I make any of these choices or set up my life in this way, but as I'm living out that mythology. Um, so that's just a little bit about Adonis and how I've experienced them in my lived experience. So,
Yeah. And it's super cool how, you know, I've noticed this too when you start to really live out certain themes or question parts of your own life, you start noticing these asteroids that, like, just to go along with what you were saying, that really embody these things that you also happen to be going through. And so there's a part of it that almost makes you feel less alone in it and like
yeah.
seen. And it's like, well, what did they do? Because maybe I'll I'll take note.
Yeah, it connects you to stories that are bigger than yourself, which is
Yeah.
really, empowering.
Yeah, really special.
Yeah. And then, so I don't just have one asteroid conjunct my ascendant, I have
Mhm.
two. I have a very spicy ascendant.
You have
And so I
multiple, don't you?
also, well, I also have like so many asteroids in my first house, but my
Yeah, okay.
ascendant is 28 degrees Libra, and I have
Mhm.
Adonis at 26 Libra and Ceres at 27 Libra. And then I have like everyone
Oh,
else in
okay.
like the first
Sure.
decan of Libra.
Gotcha.
But yeah, lots of it's a
They're
very
all just
busy
hanging
first
out.
house.
Yeah.
But the other asteroid, and that's, one distinction that we talk about in our Asteroids 101 episode, but like within 3 degrees of your ascendant sun or moon or ascendant
Yeah.
ruler, those are the most potent asteroids for you. So like Adonis and
Mhm.
Ceres are more potent for me because they're like conjunct my ascendant within like 2 degrees, 1 to 2 degrees, whereas all the other
Mhm.
asteroids that are like 20 degrees from my ascendant are not as significant. But
You can
Ceres,
always still use those though, sorry to interrupt.
yeah, no, go
You
ahead.
can still yeah, you can still use them and, like, you'll still get a story out of them even if they're just in your first house because it's still, like, an embodiment of you if it's your first house. But the story just won't be as potent if it's not conjunct your ascendant or another personal planet or anything.
Yeah.
Just to, like, share that.
And also that like that's just what the theory says. Like
Mhm.
Hellenistic theory says that a 3 degree orb is the most potent for an
Yeah.
aspect, but like asteroids and Hellenistic theory are two different approaches, and we're all just living this out,
Mm.
and life and theory are different. So, like, it's
Right,
just nice to
and
have some guidelines to focus because there's 27,000 asteroids.
right.
But if you have an asteroid at a different point in your chart and you're like, no, they're really significant to me, like your experience is more important than whatever the theory says.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Okay. um, so then just talking about Ceres a little bit, and like there's so much good work that so many people have put out about Ceres
Yeah,
or Demeter. Ceres is the Roman version, Demeter is the Greek version. She's the mother of
yeah.
Persephone.
Which
I'm
there
gonna
are
link
2 separate asteroids for those 2 also,
that is
which is
true. You can look
important
up
to
both and see where they show up.
yes.
And same like Persephone and
Mhm,
Proserpina is another
mhm.
version of Persephone. And there's a Hades asteroid. Pluto is a planet, maybe. Who knows what Pluto is? They're lurking in the
Mm.
corner. But
Pluto exists as Pluto.
but there's ways you can look up these, mythic entities under different
Yeah.
names and different like,
Yeah, because
you
one
know,
name might even
cultural
resonate more than the other one.
pantheons. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
exactly. Um, but the mother of Persephone, Ceres, who was the first asteroid discovered, is conjunct my ascendant. And we do a couple episodes talking about the asteroid goddesses. And then there's so many people that have done so many amazing, like so much research around Ceres and Demeter.
Mhm,
Our friend Liz Grace, who also attended the asteroid goddesses conference with Demetra George, Liz did a really good, thorough episode on like all of the mythology associated with Ceres, so we'll link to that. But I just want to bring Ceres in here because we're talking about my ascendant and asteroids conjunct my ascendant, and Ceres and Adonis are connected because Adonis is Persephone's lover and
mhm.
Ceres is Persephone's mother, and they're both part of that underworld mythology. And so, like I'd already said, that's a signature, a major signature in my chart. You can see that
Yeah.
multiple ways. I also have Mercury conjunct my ascendant, and Hermes is part of that myth as the messenger who can travel between the different worlds and go down to the underworld and see that Persephone has been kidnapped by Hades. And then I'm a Libra rising, so my Venus is very important because she rules Libra, and my Venus is conjunct Pluto within a degree. So like that myth, it's there. And I grew up in a basement. I already talked about my basement experiences, but my childhood was also in a basement. I've had some pretty difficult, intense experiences with trauma and abuse, and a lot of my lived experience is continually needing to go internally, going into my own underworld and, working with my implicit beliefs that are, really difficult, like beliefs that make me feel like I'm not very worthwhile, that it's not safe to be in my body, that the world is out
Mhm.
to get me, like, really scary, difficult fears and traumas. But so
Yeah.
much of my life is a commitment to casting webs of healing and to participating in regeneration. And that is what underworld mythology also teaches us, is that when you
Mhm,
compost the shit, literally, like it creates flowers. And
mhm,
because I've had such difficult experiences in my life, I've been able to go and, work in social work and help people. Like I worked at a women's shelter in Seattle for homeless women and like helped people through their underworld journeys in that field, which social work is its own, like that's a whole conversation about how difficult social work is. But that was a version of my underworld mythology. Now I'm an herbalist and an astrologer, who's really focused on facilitating safety and empowerment and helping other
mhm,
people work through like their muck and their underworld stuff to, find empowerment and to find healing with that. And
mhm,
so, while it's like my life has been quite difficult, the underworld is a very dark and scary place to inhabit. There's also like Persephone comes back up in the spring and you have beautiful flowers that sprout as a result of her time underground. And that's what I really try to be a commitment of. And, with my herbalism, that's, I think, really how I live out Ceres mythology. And I found out about Ceres on my ascendant right after I started studying herbalism, which is another way that, Ceres made herself known to me when I got myself on her path. And so, connecting to the plants, connecting to the skies, connecting to these forces that are much bigger than us to support us and
Mhm.
help us through these like very scary, difficult parts of
Yeah.
life is kind of what my embodiment is all about.
Well, and I also want to point out too, it's kind of interesting that in the mandala that Demetra has with the four main goddesses, Ceres is the IC. It's the embodiment of kind of that like metaphorical basement, the internal basement.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Yeah,
Thanks for pointing that out.
sure.
Well, did you want to talk about like Persephone and Demeter and how they've shown up
Yeah.
in your life a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't really have a prominent series in my chart at all. She's kind of just hanging out by herself. Um I do have a quick story about Demeter, and then Persephone is actually 4 degrees away from my sun. So technically not a real conjunction. um, but it's 1 degree away from it. And I really liked what Demetra was saying at the retreat about how people who have a strong Persephone, especially on the sun or like on the moon or a really personal planet, tend to look very young and get treated like they're very young. That was something that I like wrote down multiple times because that is like a really big thing in my life. Um, Especially like because I've taught fitness classes for 12 years, I've always had people come up and like question my age and question like different things like that and question my knowledge because of my age. And everything I do, I feel like I've had so many weird moments where I've had to defend my knowledge, defend myself, my sense of self, because I look younger than I am. Um, and that's been like a really weird theme in my life that I've noticed a lot. And so when she was talking about that with Persephone, it just kind of made me laugh because I was like, okay, there it is. Just another piece. And I have noticed it too. I've talked to a few other people who have like a prominent Persephone. um, there's also a little bit of, like, feeling trapped that can come with Persephone. As the asteroid, there can be, like, this area of life where you feel like maybe you don't, um, have full ability to make your own decisions, or you feel like maybe somebody could be, like, controlling you a little bit, which I did think was interesting that, for me, my son and Persephone are in my 8th house of other people's money and resources, um, and I have noticed that, like, I've had a lot of weird themes, weird 8th house stuff in my life, and I have a lot of 8th house energy anyway, so, like, there's a lot of it, but I have noticed that there have been moments where it's been hard for me to make money, or there's been weird roadblocks because of a boss or because of other weird situations that like very much made me realize that I needed to be doing my own thing. And I kind of feel like Persephone had something to do with that part of it as well. Like working for bosses has never been a a good situation in my life. And so, um, yeah, I have thought about that part of the Persephone asteroid um, as well. The craziest story though that I have with Persephone and Demeter. So I am dating somebody who's currently living in Antarctica. And that's been a big dating pattern for me. I find people who go to the other side of the world in 3 to 6 months. And that's what usually ends the relationship. There's always like a physical distance um, in my relationships. And right before he left, I started really deep diving into some of the asteroids in his chart too. And I found that Persephone in his chart is 1 degree away from Demeter in my chart. And it's in the fifth house of dating, both in Scorpio. And I also have Pluto in Scorpio at 25 degrees, and his name in my chart is 26 degrees Scorpio. So I just started laughing because I was like, oh, I'm Demeter hanging out still in Ohio while he goes to Antarctica, the literal underworld. um and all of this has, like, very much coincided with the Pluto transits as well. Pluto I'm a Cancer rising, so Pluto has been in my 7th house since 2008, and, me and this guy met right like, the week Pluto moved into Aquarius, and then, of course, it retrograded back. And so yeah, it's been really funny that, like, there's been so many weird Pluto signs in the relationship, but then there's literally the underworld aspect of it, and, he left for 4 months. So, going back into that part of the myth as well, the winter for 4 months and then the resurgence. So, um, yeah, that's been a really funny one to discover as well.
Yeah, I think that one's crazy. And it's so cool to
Mhm.
look at like how asteroids can show up between your chart and someone else's chart. And because there's,
Yeah.
27,000 asteroids, a lot of our names are asteroids. And especially like Alex is definitely an
Mhm.
asteroid. That's a common name. And so looking
Right.
up, friends, people you're dating, your mom, different people in your lives' names and
Mhm.
seeing where they are in your chart, you can find some really interesting stuff.
Yeah, my last name is conjunct Jupiter in my 4th house of home and family.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
and I've heard a lot of stories like that. Yeah, I think we should do a whole different episode on names. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, that's been, something that I've been thinking about a lot is how, like, you know, Demeter is not prominent in my chart. It's at like 5 degrees of Scorpio in my 5th house, and Pluto's 20 degrees away from it. So, it's by itself. It's not doing anything. And in Alex's chart, he has Chiron in Scorpio. And so I think Persephone was pretty close to Chiron for him. I think it's at 0 degrees. I think they were like 4 or 5 degrees away from each other. But that's it for his chart too. So it's like 2 asteroids that have seemingly nothing to do with each other. Once we place them in a synastry chart, now they tell a story that goes into my life, right? It like affects my patterns and it affects my relationship. Um, so yeah, like even when you think something isn't prominent or important, it could just be playing out a bigger story. So I think things like that are always so crazy, especially when neither people have like any actual planets there.
Yeah. And just going back to kind of what we've said multiple times this episode, but a lot of times asteroids will come into your consciousness
Yes,
when they're ready to and when your
sure.
life, like their mythology is starting to show up in your life. And so if you're like, oh my God, there's 27,000 asteroids, and then they're just like showing up, and like, how am I supposed to know what and where and what's important? Like, the asteroids will make themselves
Yeah.
known to you when they're meant to if you're steeping yourself in this world, So get like an asteroid astrology reading from me or
Mhm.
Lori. Start looking up random asteroids in your chart, start reading different mythologies that are resonant to you and just see what makes itself like aware to you, but also don't
Mhm.
stress it if nothing's really showing up prominently, because maybe the story will unfold like in a different
Yeah,
way
and
that you don't know.
I think a really good way to go about it too is just like, well, what resonates? Look them
Mhm.
up.
Yeah, exactly. Just
Yeah,
like start reading myth, like what myth is interesting to you.
right. Exactly.
Well, That's kind of everything I had to say about underworld mythology and asteroids. And also, I guess just tying back because we did an episode talking about how the four asteroid goddesses should be treated as planets. And my chart's a really good example of that because I have Ceres conjunct my ascendant, and then I have Pluto conjunct my ascendant ruler. And both of them are just as
Mhm.
significant to me, and just like your ascendant and your ascendant ruler, like from a Hellenistic perspective, are equally significant, I believe.
Mhm.
Really traditional Hellenistic people, please correct me if there's like doctrine that says one is more important than the other, but to me they seem pretty
Mm.
like
Yeah,
they
they're
both
pretty important.
represent the self and they're pretty
Right.
important.
Right.
But Ceres and Pluto kind of showing up in similar ways in my chart, even though one was a planet and isn't, and we're all confused, and then one is an asteroid, but was like the first asteroid and like
Mhm.
equal, like
Yeah.
Ceres and Hades are siblings, and Ceres as a goddess is actually much older. So,
Yeah, and just the fact that like Ceres is the first asteroid. It was
mhm,
like it's the biggest one. Like even just
mhm,
looking at it like that's prominent. That's important. Um
yeah.
and yeah, using the bigger characters can definitely be a great place to start.
Also, this is like very scattered of me, but another way that Ceres shows up that's very prominent in my life actually is my grandfather, my late grandfather, who I love very much, was a botanist and
Mhm.
studied or dedicated his life to studying the history of civilization and agriculture and like plants like corn and tomatoes
Yeah.
and potatoes and like all of these plants that have been really tied together with human like civilization and history. And
Yeah.
Ceres and Demeter is the goddess of agriculture. Like she's a goddess of plants, but particularly like plants that are nourishing and humans cultivating plants for our nourishment. And my grandpa, I don't have a birth time for him, but his Ceres forms a grand trine in his birth chart. I forget what the other two planets are, but he has
Oh,
like planets and points in all three water signs that are all really closely together that form a
mm.
triangle. And Ceres is one of them. And so she was prominent in his
Oh,
chart.
interesting.
He studied agriculture. So, yeah, it's just fun
Yeah,
to see those sorts of ways that the asteroids show up.
absolutely. Yeah, that's super cool.
Cool. Well, what do you have going on, Lori, to wrap up?
I have some fun Valentine's deals. I had decided to I'm giving a lecture in April again. And I decided to switch it from the elements lecture that I usually do over to the asteroids and start really doing a lot of this work. So I in honor of that to celebrate, I am offering 20% off my asteroid readings right now. So, and I'll probably continue that for another week or two. I don't nothing structured. But yeah, if you're interested in learning more about your asteroids, that'll be a great place to start. For Valentine's Day, I'm working with Lila, who we will have on soon. Um, and she does the Cards of Destiny or Love Card system. And so we have like a little dual offering for Valentine's Day where she does the synastry within your cards and I do the synastry within astrology. So all of that is on my linked on my Instagram right now. Um, I also am still writing my book on the asteroids as well. So if anybody has any personal stories or anything you want to share that would be good for a book example, feel free to reach out and send me those. I always want to hear your stories. So yeah, send them over, reach out. And then other than that, just kind of doing my regular readings and I don't think there's too much else that's new. What about you?
I am taking this winter pretty slowly. As we just talked
Mhm.
about this whole episode, my life is a cyclical, constantly changing kind of wheel of work and energy. And so I'm not doing a lot of readings or tea blends or anything right now. but I am doing a lot of writing and reflecting. And I think especially relevant to this episode is I just recently wrote a blog post on how to build ancestral relations. um, that's another way that the underworld mythology really shows up in my life. Is my main spiritual practice is me working with my ancestors and communing with them, and I'm constantly praying to my ancestors and speaking with them. And I've experienced a lot of death in my life, so I have a lot of people who I really know and love closely who are my ancestors, but I also have
Mhm.
ancestors from so far ago. And the rocks and the plants and the fungi are my ancestors, and other astrologers and other queer people and other women and mentally ill people. I have so many ancestors, and they feel like,
Mhm.
especially the kindly and well ones, I do a lot of work to keep them close and to honor them, and I feel really nourished and supported and protected by them. And so I wrote a blog post about, how you can kind of start to build ancestral relations yourself, and some things that have worked for me, some of my philosophy, ways to protect yourself, because, you don't want to just invite
Mm.
everyone's energy in. And I think that can be a big danger with magic and spirit work, is when people don't fully believe in it or think it's real, they can kind of do things distracted or just
Yeah.
invite the dead to come visit them. And it's nice to have a bit more intention and boundaries about how you interact with your ancestors. And so I go through that in my post, and, ways to make offerings, ways to know whether they're, like how to feel them and how to center yourself to actually, interact with your ancestors. So I'll link that as well if anyone's interested in working on ancestral relations. And I've also been working on doing a lot of research on different herbs and writing herbal monographs, kind of herbal materia
Mm.
medicas, for my herb school, Artemisia Academy. And so I have a collection of, at this point, I've written probably 15 or 20, like in depth, like thoroughly researched posts about rosemary and calendula and elderberry and dandelion and eleuthero and all these different herbs, just to have more information out there. And this post that I've compiled kind of all of my research on these herbs, I also include a lot of the books that I go to and a lot of the resources that I use, because there is a lot of BS out there about herbalism, let me tell you.
Mm.
And so
Astrology
having
too.
yes, and so having well-researched,
Mm.
like, resources from people who are, clinical herbalists, they're doing this every day, they've been doing it for decades, they know the plants well, they know how to work with them. That's really important. Don't
Yeah,
just willy-nilly take herbs because they're plants and they're safe and they're natural, right? You need to know how herbs work, and you need to respect them because they are quite potent and quite effective. So yeah, so I've just been putting a lot of resources
mhm,
together on my blog, and just doing a lot of writing, which has felt really nice to be doing.
absolutely. Very cool.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening. We'll be doing several more asteroid stories episodes, so stay tuned for those.
Yeah.
And if you have any asteroid stories that you would like to share, please share them with us. Please reach out. The more we talk about these, asteroids were only discovered in the 1800s, and these techniques are really being developed by us in the here and
Yeah.
now. And so the more stories we have, the more we can see how asteroids are really playing out in people's lives.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm finishing up writing a book right now, so if you want your stories shared in there, I'm always collecting stories, always. So, please reach out with that, and if you wanna come on here and share your story on the podcast as well, um, feel free to let us know that. We do have an Instagram now, so follow us, reach out, message us, or you can message either of us personally, it doesn't really matter.
Mhm.
Um and then also if you just wanna talk to somebody or share, or if you're looking for a reading, you can reach out to us for that too.
Yeah, and
Doesn't
if you
have to
even
be
just have
serious.
any quick, simple questions like, "Wait, what
Yeah.
was how does this work?" If it's too in-depth, we'll be like, "Please get a reading." But, quick, easy
Right.
questions. We want people to be working with asteroids in their charts, and we wanna be a
Yeah,
resource for you guys, so please be in touch.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Bye.